The town had no official name, not anymore. It was a place lost to time, nestled deep within a sprawling ancient forest. Roads led to it eventually if you knew where to look. But, few ever did. The forest seemed to swallow the sounds of the outside world. It created a pocket of stillness. A heavy, expectant silence hung over the clustered houses. Their paint peeled, their windows watched like vacant eyes. This was a town that held its breath, waiting. For what, no one could precisely say. But the feeling was there. It clung to the damp air like the moss on the ancient oaks. Life moved slowly here, glacially. The residents were few. They were people who knew the contours of silence intimately. They spoke in low tones, their words carefully chosen, as if loud noises might disturb something old, something best left sleeping. The children, those few who remained, played quiet games. Their laughter was a rare, almost startling sound. It echoed briefly, then was absorbed by the ever-present woods. The elders sat on their porches. They rocked in their chairs, their gazes fixed on the tree line, a line that seemed to creep closer each year. The town felt forgotten by the sun. Even on the brightest days, shadows lingered. They stretched long and distorted from the gnarled trees. They pooled in the alleyways between the leaning buildings. The main street, a ribbon of cracked asphalt, saw little traffic. An occasional truck rumbled through. Its engine sounded like an intrusion, a violation of the town's solemn quiet. Stores stood with faded signs. Their windows were dusty. Some were boarded up, relics of a time when the town perhaps had a name. A time before the whispers started. It was a place where secrets were currency, where the past was not a distant memory. It was a living presence. It walked the quiet streets alongside the living. It settled in the corners of rooms. It whispered in the rustle of leaves. The town itself seemed to breathe, a slow, shallow breath. Each inhale drew in the scent of pine and damp earth. Each exhale released a sigh of resignation, of acceptance. This was their world. A world bordered by trees and defined by an unspoken dread, a dread that had become a part of them. They called it the Silent Watcher, or sometimes the Whisper in the Pines. The legend had no single definitive name, much like the town itself.
It was an amorphous fear. A story passed down through generations. Each telling added a new layer of detail, a fresh coat of unease. Some said it was a spirit, a guardian of the ancient woods angered by the town's intrusion. Others believed it was something more tangible, something human, or at least, something that once was. The specifics were always hazy, lost in the mists of time and fear.
The mystery was not about a single event. It was not a crime that could be solved with clues and investigation. It was an enduring presence, a chilling undercurrent to their daily lives. It was the reason doors were locked early, the reason parents warned their children not to stray too far into the woods that encircled them like a hungry beast. The legend spoke of disappearances, people who walked into the trees and never walked out. No trace, no explanation, just an absence, a void left in the fabric of the small community. These stories were the town's dark folklore.
This pervasive legend shaped the town's psyche. It fostered a sense of isolation, not just from the outside world, but from each other. Suspicion was a quiet companion. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every unexplained noise could be a sign.
The townsfolk were polite, but guarded. Their eyes held a knowing sadness, a shared burden of living under the shadow of the unseen. They lived with a constant, low hum of anxiety. It was the soundtrack to their lives, a melody of fear composed by the rustling leaves and the creaking branches. The core of the mystery lay in its persistence, its refusal to fade. Decades passed. The world outside changed. But here, the legend remained, potent, unyielding. Who or what was responsible for the disappearances? Was it a single entity, or a series of unfortunate, unrelated tragedies woven together by fear? These questions hung in the air, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. They were the ghosts that haunted not just the woods, but every home, every mind. The legend was a living thing, and it was hungry. The woods surrounding the Nameless town were a character in their own right, ancient, imposing. Their depths were largely unexplored by the townsfolk. They were a place of respect and profound fear. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy. It left the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. Twisted roots snaked across the paths like petrified serpents. The air within was always cooler, still, as if the trees themselves held their breath. It was into these woods that young Thomas Henderson ventured one crisp autumn afternoon. He was looking for lost arrowheads, or so he told his mother. He wandered further than usual, deeper than caution advised. The familiar sounds of the town faded behind him, replaced by the snap of twigs underfoot, the distant caw of a crow.
I felt the familiar prickle of unease, like the sense of being watched. But, the lure of discovery, of finding something unique, just pushed me onward. Then I saw it. Not an arrowhead, something else. Something partially buried beneath a pile of damp leaves. A splash of unnatural color against the muted browns and greens of the forest floor. A dull, metallic glint.
Thomas knelt, his heart hammered against his ribs. He brushed away the leaves with a trembling hand. It was a small metal box, or perhaps a locket, tarnished with age, intricately carved. It felt cold to the touch, too cold.
I pried it open. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, was not a picture, not a keepsake, but a single tiny, oddly shaped bone, and a folded piece of brittle parchment. My breath caught in my throat. This was no ordinary find. This felt wrong, deeply wrong.
A cold dread washed over him, colder than the metal in his hand. This discovery was a stone dropped into a still, dark pool. The ripples began to spread almost immediately. This was not just a lost trinket. It felt like a message, a dark omen. It was tangible proof that the woods held more than just shadows and whispers. They held secrets, buried secrets. The locket, the bone, the parchment, they were a key to a story the town had tried to forget, or perhaps a story that was still being written. The unsettling discovery in the woods promised to drag the old legends out of the realm of folklore and into the harsh light of a terrifying reality. Thomas Henderson stumbled from the woods. His face was pale, chalk white. He clutched the small cold locket in his hand. The forest chill seemed to cling to him, to the metal he held. He ran. He did not look back. He showed his parents first. His mother gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. His father's eyes, usually steady, flickered with a deep, old fear. This was not some child's trinket. This was a shard of the town's buried pain, a relic of the unspoken. They knew, instantly, that this find meant trouble. The kind of trouble that never truly left. News of the locket traveled, not by phone, for few lines reached this far. It moved on hushed words, carried on anxious breaths, from neighbor to neighbor. It seeped through the cracks in the silence. The object itself, small and tarnished, grew in stature. It became a symbol, a dark star. People gathered in the dim light of the general store. They spoke in low murmurs. Their eyes darted towards the woods, then back to each other. The locket lay on the counter of the Hendersons' kitchen, a silent accusation, a heavy weight upon the entire town. Martha, the town's oldest resident, heard the news. Her grandson told her. He spoke with a tremor in his voice. She sat in her rocking chair, her gaze fixed on the distant tree line. She did not seem surprised, only weary. A long, slow sigh escaped her lips, like air from a punctured lung. "So," she finally whispered, her voice raspy with age. "It has begun again." Her words hung in the air, heavy, ominous. The locket was not just an object from the past, it was a key that could unlock a door best left sealed. The question of what to do pricked at the town's conscience. Some suggested burying it again, deep in the woods, deeper this time. Others wanted it thrown in the river, washed away, forgotten. But Thomas had found it. The woods had given it up. The town's informal leader, a stoic man named Silas Blackwood, was consulted. He ran the town's only store. He listened, his face a mask. He knew this locket meant the past was no longer content to sleep. It was stirring, and it was hungry for their attention. The locket and its tiny, grim contents demanded to be seen. The discovery of the locket acted like a stone cast into a still, dark pond. The ripples spread quickly. They disturbed the carefully constructed calm of the nameless town. Dormant fears, long suppressed, began to awaken. Conversations started in hushed tones, behind closed doors, in shadowed corners of the general store. People remembered. They remembered the stories their parents told, stories of those who had walked into the woods and never returned. Names unspoken for years were uttered once more. Each name was a ghost, a fresh stab of an old wound. Before these disappearances were explained away, excuses were made. He wandered off, they would say. She left for a better life in the city. Or most commonly, the woods took them. The vast, unknowable forest was always the convenient culprit, a silent, hungry entity. But the locket felt different. It was man-made, intricate, containing something so deliberately placed. The bone, the parchment, these spoke of human hands, human intent, or something mimicking it with chilling precision. The old explanations now felt hollow, thin veils over a much darker truth. The forest had always been a source of both sustenance and dread. It provided wood, it provided game, but it also watched, it encroached. The townsfolk believed it possessed a spirit, a will of its own. This belief made the disappearances almost natural, a toll extracted by an ancient power. But the locket challenged this. It suggested something more personal, more sinister, something that walked among them, or lurked just beyond the tree line, waiting, observing, choosing. The fear shifted. It became less about the ancient woods and more about an unseen intelligence. One particular rumor resurfaced with chilling clarity, the story of Alara Vance, a young woman who vanished 50 years prior. She was last seen picking berries near Hemlock Creek. They found her basket, full of ripe fruit. But Alara was gone. No trace, no struggle, just an empty space where a life had been. Some said they heard a strange melody in the woods that day. Others saw a tall, dark figure at the edge of the trees. The locket with its tiny bone made them wonder, was Alara the first, or just one of many? The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The locket's grim presence forced a reckoning. A few townsfolk, braver or perhaps more haunted than others, began to actively dig into the past. They did not want to rely on fragmented whispers. They sought something more concrete. Old Elijah, the retired schoolteacher, retrieved his journals. He had kept meticulous records for decades, not just of weather patterns, but of town events, of arrivals and departures, especially the unexplained departures. He ran a trembling finger down lists of names, each one a forgotten sorrow, a question mark hanging in time. Sarah, a younger woman who had returned to care for her aging father, felt a growing unease. She had heard the legends as a child, but dismissed them as folklore. Now, the locket made them real. She began to ask questions, gently, carefully. She visited Martha. She spoke to the other elders. She listened to their hesitant recollections. Their voices were often soft, their eyes clouded with a mixture of fear and sadness. Many were reluctant to speak, as if uttering the names of the lost might summon the darkness back, or attract its unwelcome attention. Collecting the memories was like gathering mist. Details were elusive. Time had eroded the sharp edges of events. Fear had distorted others. Some remembered a disappearance in summer. Others swore it was autumn. Dates were confused, timelines blurred. Was it 3 people who vanished in the year of the Great Fire, or 4? The fear was a constant impediment, a heavy cloak smothering the truth. Best let sleeping dogs lie, one old man muttered, his gaze averted. Talking about it won't bring them back. It only stirs the shadows. Despite the resistance, a list began to take shape. Sarah and Elijah worked together, cross-referencing stories, comparing notes, name by name, year by year. The lost were being counted, documented. The sheer number was staggering, far more than anyone had openly acknowledged. These were not isolated incidents, not random tragedies. Laid out on paper, the list painted a grim picture, a pattern of loss that stretched back generations. The town's hidden history of sorrow was slowly, painfully coming to light. The silence was breaking. As Elijah and Sarah compiled their list, a chilling awareness began to dawn. These were not random acts of misfortune. There was something else at play. Martha, observing their quiet investigation, nodded slowly one afternoon. "Look closer," she urged, her voice barely a whisper. Not just who, but how and when. She guided them, prompted them to examine the details that lay beneath the surface of grief and fear. Were all the victims similar in some way? Or was their only connection the place they called home, and the woods that surrounded it? They reviewed the circumstances of each disappearance. Many were last seen near the Whisperwood, a particularly dense and ancient part of the forest. Others vanished during specific times of the year. The autumn months, when the veil between worlds felt thin, or during the deep, isolating snows of winter. The locket itself, found by Thomas, was discovered near the old abandoned Trapper's Trail, a path rarely used, a place where someone could move unseen. These small details, once disparate, began to connect, forming faint lines, weaving a disturbing tapestry. The parchment, the small brittle piece of paper tucked inside the locket with the bone. It had been carefully unfolded. On it, a single spidery symbol. Not a letter, not a number, but a strange looping sigil. Unknown, unsettling. Was it a mark? A signature? They showed it to Martha. Her breath hitched. She claimed to have seen it once before. Long ago, scratched into the door of a house whose occupants later vanished. The symbol became another thread, a tangible link between the locket and the town's dark history. The realization settled upon them, heavy and cold. This was not the work of the forest alone. This was not a series of tragic accidents. There was a design, a chilling purpose, an intelligence that selected, that planned, that executed its grim work in silence. The silent watcher of legend was perhaps more than just a spirit, the first true, terrifying hint of a killer. Human or otherwise, it was methodical, patient, and it had been part of their town for a very long time. The past was not just a collection of sad stories, it was an active threat, and it was far from over. The autumn air grew colder, sharper. The days shortened, surrendering quickly to long, oppressive nights. It was during this season, many years after the first whispers began, that the most infamous event occurred. An event that seared itself into the town's memory. It was a night unlike any other. The usual quiet felt different, taut, strained, as if the very air was bracing for impact. Even the crickets seemed to have muted their chorus. The wind, when it sighed through the pines, carried a mournful, chilling tone. The moon was a sliver, offering little comfort, little light. The Miller family lived on the outskirts of town. Their small farmstead was nestled close to the edge of the Whisperwood. A little too close, some always said. John and Mary Miller, with their two young children, Emily and Samuel, were well liked. They were simple folk, hard-working. Their laughter, though infrequent in this somber town, was genuine. On this particular evening, they had finished their supper. The lamps in their windows cast a warm, inviting glow, a stark contrast to the encroaching darkness that surrounded their isolated home, a fragile island of light in a sea of black. Later, people would try to piece together the mundane details of that evening, searching for omens, for warnings they might have missed. Old Man Hemlock, their nearest neighbor, recalled seeing John Miller mending a fence late in the afternoon. He waved. John waved back. Nothing seemed amiss. Mary had hung out her washing earlier. The white sheets flapped gently in the breeze like surrender flags before she took them in. The children's excited shouts as they played in the yard had faded with the setting sun. Just another ordinary day, it seemed. But the night was watching, waiting. The nameless town held its collective breath, unknowing. But a primal instinct, perhaps, stirred in the hearts of its residents, an ancient sense of foreboding. Doors were bolted a little tighter that night. Curtains were drawn more securely. The silence that descended was deeper, more profound. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, or something far worse. The forest stood as a dark, impenetrable wall. Its shadows stretched long fingers towards the Miller Farmstead, towards the unsuspecting family within. The stage was set for a horror that would redefine fear. No one knows exactly when the silence of the Miller farm was broken, or by what. The nearest neighbors, the Hemlocks, lived nearly a mile away, too far to hear a casual sound, too far to hear a muffled cry. The darkness of the Whisperwood was absolute that night. It swallowed sounds, it swallowed light, it swallowed hope. Whatever happened at the Miller farm happened under a cloak of impenetrable blackness. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying secrets it would never fully reveal. Only tiny, terrifying fragments would later emerge. Old Man Hemlock swore he heard his dogs barking, a frantic, agitated sound, sometime after midnight. He had dismissed it, coyotes perhaps, or a stray deer. He rolled over in his bed, pulled the covers tighter. The barking eventually subsided, replaced by an even more profound silence, a silence that felt heavy, unnatural. He would later torture himself with this memory, the memory of ignoring the one possible warning, the one chance he might have had. The dogs, usually brave, were found cowering under his porch the next morning, whimpering, refusing to come out. Inside the Miller house, the scene must have been one of unimaginable terror. The struggle, the fear, the desperate, futile attempts to fight back, or to flee. These details remain locked within those blood-soaked walls. The killer, or killers, moved with a chilling efficiency, a brutal precision. There were no witnesses, only the silent, unblinking eyes of the forest. And the moon, a pale sliver that offered no protection. The act was swift. It was devastating. It was an act of pure, unadulterated malice, an evil that had finally shown its terrible face. The legend of the Silent Watcher had always spoken of disappearances, of people taken by the woods. But this was different. This was not a quiet vanishing. This was an invasion, a violation, a slaughter. The entity, whether spirit or human, had crossed a new threshold. It had come out of the woods. It had entered a home. It had shattered the illusion of safety, however fragile, that the townsfolk clung to. The Miller Farmstead, once a symbol of simple life, became a monument to a new, more aggressive horror, a horror that left its bloody signature. Sarah, who had been collecting the town's fragmented memories, found herself drawn into this new nightmare. She hadn't known the Millers well. Few people truly knew each other in the guarded way of the nameless town, but she knew their children's faces. She had seen Emily and Samuel playing, their innocent joy a rare bloom in the desolate landscape. The news of what happened at the farmstead reached her like a physical blow. She felt a cold dread creep into her heart, a dread far deeper than any of the old legends had instilled. This was real, horrifyingly real.
I remember the morning after, Sarah would later recount, her voice low, her gaze distant, as if replaying the scene in her mind. Old man Hemlock came into the general store. His face, it was grey, like ash. He could barely speak. He just kept shaking his head, muttering about his dogs, muttering about the silence. Silas Blackwood, he closed the store. He and a few of the other men. They went out to the Miller farm. I wanted to go, but I was too afraid. We all were. We waited, and the waiting was terrible. Every minute felt like an hour. When they came back, Sarah continued, her voice catching. Their faces told the story. No one needed to say the words. The horror was written there, etched into their eyes. Silas, he's a strong man, seen a lot, but he looked broken. He said it was like nothing he'd ever seen, not even in the war. He told us to keep our children inside, to lock our doors, not just at night, but during the day too. He said that the thing that did this, it wasn't just the woods anymore. It felt like it was one of us, or something pretending to be. The fear. She paused, taking a shaky breath. It changed after that. It wasn't just a story anymore. It wasn't just whispers about people vanishing. This was a massacre. The Millers, all of them, even the children. Emily was only 6. Samuel was 8. Who could do such a thing? What kind of monster? The locket Thomas found, the old disappearances, they felt like a prelude, like a warning we didn't understand. But the Miller farm, that was a declaration, a statement that no one was safe, not anymore. The silent killer, whatever it was, had shown its hand, and it was terrifying.
When Silas Blackwood and the small group of men reached the Miller farmstead, the morning sun was just beginning to pierce the gloom. It cast long, eerie shadows across the yard. The unnatural quiet was the first thing that struck them. No rooster crowed, no dog barked a greeting. The front door was slightly ajar, a dark invitation into a scene of unimaginable horror. Silas, his face grim, pushed it open. The metallic scent of blood, heavy and sickening, assaulted them immediately. It clung to the air, a silent testament to the violence that had occurred. Inside, the small farmhouse was a scene of devastation. Furniture was overturned, belongings scattered, as if a whirlwind of fury had torn through the rooms. But it was the stillness that was most terrifying, the final, awful stillness of the Miller family. John and Mary were found in their bedroom, their lives brutally taken. The details were too gruesome to speak aloud, too horrific to linger on. Their faces were frozen in expressions of ultimate terror. The men, hardened by a life of quiet struggle, turned away. Their stomachs churned, their hearts ached with a profound, helpless sorrow. The children, Emily and Samuel, were found in their small beds, tucked in as if asleep. But they were not asleep. The same savage violence that had claimed their parents had not spared them. This discovery broke something in the men. Silas felt a cold rage mixed with his grief. This was not just murder. This was an abomination, an act that defied all comprehension, an act that tore at the very fabric of their small, isolated community. They covered the bodies gently, reverently. Their hands trembled, their eyes burned with unshed tears. Word spread through the nameless town like wildfire, carried by the shaken men who returned from the farm. Each telling was brief, choked with emotion. The town reeled. Disbelief warred with a sickening certainty. This was not a legend. This was not a rumor. This was a brutal, undeniable fact. The Miller family was gone, slaughtered in their own home by an unseen, unknown assailant. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but its light brought no warmth, no comfort, only the cold, harsh revelation of a nightmare made real. The town was plunged into a darkness deeper than any night. The brutal murder of the Miller family shattered the fragile peace of the nameless town. The old fears, the whispers of the silent watcher, transformed overnight. They solidified into a palpable, suffocating dread. Before, the threat was amorphous, a mystery in the woods. Now it had a face, a brutal, bloodthirsty face. It had crossed the threshold from the wilderness into their homes. No lock felt strong enough, no door seemed secure. The very air seemed to crackle with a new, terrifying energy. The town was no longer just haunted by a legend, it was hunted. Daily life ground to a halt. Children were kept indoors, their laughter silenced, their games forgotten. The schoolhouse remained empty, its windows dark. The general store saw few customers. When people did venture out, they moved in groups, their eyes darting nervously towards the trees, towards the shadows, towards each other. Suspicion, once a subtle undercurrent, now flowed openly.
Could the killer be one of us? A neighbor? A friend? Someone we see every day?
The thought was poison. It eroded trust. It frayed the already thin bonds of the community. Silas Blackwood tried to maintain order. He organized patrols. Men walked the perimeter of the town at night, armed with old rifles and a desperate resolve, but they all knew it was a futile gesture. The killer was silent, cunning. It had struck with impunity, and it could strike again, anytime, anywhere. The forest, once a source of sustenance, now felt like a cage, its endless trees a mocking reminder of their isolation, of their vulnerability. The outside world, so distant before, felt impossibly far away now. They were alone with their fear. The nights were the worst. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent hearts pounding. Sleep offered little escape. Nightmares plagued the townsfolk, vivid images of the Miller farm, of unseen horrors lurking in the darkness.
I hear things at night. I keep thinking it's coming for me next.
The legend of the silent killer was no longer a story to tell around a dwindling fire. It was a living, breathing terror. It walked their streets. It haunted their dreams. The nameless town held its breath, waiting, wondering who would be next. The reign of terror had truly begun. News of the Miller family massacre, a horror too stark to be contained by the whisper would, eventually pierced the veil of the nameless town's isolation. It traveled slowly at first, a whispered rumor carried by a rare traveler, a garbled message over a crackling phone line miles away. But the sheer brutality of the event demanded attention. Days later, a sputtering automobile arrived. It carried two grim-faced men, County Sheriff Thompson and his young, pale deputy Miller. They were the outside world, come to cast its uninvited light into the town's darkest corners. Their city shoes crunched on the neglected main street. Their presence felt like an intrusion. Sheriff Thompson was a man weathered by years of rural crime, but nothing had prepared him for the Miller farm. Silas Blackwood met them, his face a mask of grief and stoic resolve. He led them through the silent, blood-stained farmhouse. The air was still thick with the scent of death. Deputy Miller, barely a man, had to step outside. He retched into the overgrown weeds. Thompson, however, walked every room. His eyes missed nothing. The savagery, the apparent lack of struggle in some places, the ferocity in others. It was a puzzle crafted by a fiend. He noted the absence of forced entry. The killer knew how to get in, or was let in. The initial investigation began with questions. So many questions. Thompson tried to interview the townsfolk. He started with Silas, then Old Man Hemlock. He found a wall of silence, not of defiance, but of deep, ingrained fear. Their voices were low, their eyes averted. They spoke of the woods, of the legend, of a feeling, not of facts, not of suspects. Deputy Miller tried to take notes, his pen scratched nervously on his pad. He found himself writing down folklore, not evidence.
The town seemed to communicate in a language the lawmen didn't fully understand, a language of shared trauma.
The townsfolk watched the investigators with suspicion. These outsiders, with their notebooks and their probing questions, could not comprehend the true nature of the threat. They looked for a man, a motive, something tangible. But the people of the Nameless town knew, or believed they knew, that this was something more, something ancient, something intrinsically linked to the place itself. The sheriff's presence brought a flicker of hope to some, a desperate, fragile hope. But to others, it was merely a disturbance, a brief interruption before the darkness inevitably reclaimed its own. The abyss had been stirred, and it stared back. The investigation stumbled forward. It was like wading through thick, viscous mud. Sheriff Thompson, a practical man, sought logical explanations. He looked for earthly culprits. A drifter was reported to have passed through the county weeks before, a nameless man with shifty eyes and worn clothes. This became the first significant lead, a phantom to chase. The sheriff sent out bulletins. He questioned people in neighboring settlements. But the drifter was like smoke. He had vanished without a trace. A convenient scapegoat, perhaps. Too convenient for some of the older townsfolk who had seen shadows move for generations. Within the Nameless town itself, suspicion began to fester. It coiled like a serpent in the hearts of the residents. Eyes that once held shared fear now held flickers of accusation. Old Jedediah, the town eccentric who lived alone by the swamp, became a target. He muttered to himself. He kept strange hours. Children whispered he could talk to animals. He collected bones. Suddenly, his oddities seemed sinister. People remembered seeing him near the Whisperwood. His reclusiveness, once pitied, was now seen as evidence of a dark secret. He offered no defense. He just stared back with hollow eyes.
Folks started talking about Jedediah, you know? Always thought he was just a bit odd, but now, well, they saw him as dangerous. People can turn on you real quick when they're scared.
The investigators, desperate for any tangible thread, looked into Jedediah. They searched his small, cluttered shack. They found animal bones, yes. Strange carvings, bundles of dried herbs, nothing that definitively linked him to the Millers. But in a town starved for answers, perception became reality. The whispers against him grew louder, more venomous. It was easier to blame a man they already deemed an outsider within their own isolated community. It was easier than confronting the possibility that the killer was someone they trusted, someone who smiled at them in the daylight. Other red herrings emerged. A dispute over land boundaries between John Miller and a distant cousin. A tale of a hidden stash of money on the Miller farm, though none was ever found. Each lead was pursued. Each path meticulously explored by Sheriff Thompson. Each one led to a dead end. A frustrating blank wall. The killer was clever, or incredibly lucky. Or perhaps, as the town's fear suggested, not entirely of this world. The shadows of doubt lengthened. They twisted and distorted, making everyone a potential suspect, and everyone a potential victim. The truth remained buried, deep. Sheriff Thompson sat across from Silas Blackwood in the dim back room of the general store. The air was stale, heavy with unspoken grief.
Silas, Thompson began, his voice weary. I need more. Someone must have seen something, heard something, anything.
Silas stared at his rough, calloused hands.
Sheriff, he said, his voice raspy. You're looking for a man. We've been living with something else for generations. It doesn't leave tracks you can follow. It doesn't have motives you can understand. It just takes. This time, it was more brutal, but it's the same shadow.
His words were not a deflection. They were a deeply rooted belief. Deputy Miller, tasked with interviewing some of the more peripheral figures, found himself talking to Martha, the ancient woman whose memory held the town's unwritten history. She sat in her rocking chair, her eyes like faded photographs.
The killer, young man? She wheezed, a dry, knowing sound. He is the silence between the heartbeats. He is the fear that stops your breath. You look for one, but it is many. It is the town's sin. It is the forest's hunger.
Her words were cryptic, poetic, utterly unhelpful for a police report, yet they resonated with the chilling atmosphere that permeated the town. Then there was young Thomas Henderson, the boy who found the locket. He was interviewed again. He recounted finding the object, the bone, the parchment with its strange sigil.
Did you see anyone in the woods that day, Thomas? Deputy Miller asked gently. The boy shook his head, his eyes wide with a fear that hadn't left him. Just the trees, he whispered. They felt angry.
The locket was examined. The bone was too small to identify easily without expertise the county lacked. The sigil remained a mystery, a silent, mocking clue from a bygone era, now possibly linked to a fresh atrocity. Even old Jedediah, cornered and defensive, offered little more than rambling pronouncements.
They whisper about me, he croaked, his eyes darting around. But the woods whisper louder. They see everything. The real monster wears a familiar face, smiles, then strikes.
His words only served to deepen the paranoia. Was he mad? Or was he hinting at a truth too terrible to confront directly? The voices of the nameless town were a chorus of fear, grief, and suspicion. Each testimony added another layer to the oppressive mystery. But none brought them closer to the killer, only closer to the edge of despair. Days bled into weeks. The initial flurry of the investigation slowed to a crawl. Sheriff Thompson, a man driven by logic and procedure, found himself increasingly frustrated. The Miller farmhouse, scoured for clues, yielded little of substance. There were no clear fingerprints, no foreign hairs, no discarded weapon. The killer had moved with an almost supernatural care. Or perhaps, the methods of detection available were simply too crude, too unsophisticated to catch such a meticulous predator. The silence of the crime scene was deafening. It offered no answers, only more questions. The few potential leads had all dissolved. The drifter remained a ghost. The accusations against old Jedediah, while persistent among some townsfolk, lacked any concrete evidence. The land dispute proved to be minor, resolved years ago. Every path Thompson and his deputy explored seemed to curve back on itself, leading them nowhere. It was like navigating a labyrinth built of fear and silence. The townsfolk, while polite, remained guarded. Their knowledge, if any, was buried deep beneath layers of superstition and a profound distrust of outsiders. They offered stories, legends, not the hard facts needed for an arrest. The nature of the attack itself was baffling. The sheer brutality suggested a deep personal rage. Yet the Millers were described as quiet, unassuming people, with no known enemies. Who could harbor such venom towards them? And why the children? This question haunted Thompson. It spoke of a depravity that chilled him to the bone. He began to consider darker possibilities. Was this a ritual? Was there a cult hidden in the deep woods? These thoughts felt outlandish. Yet, in the oppressive atmosphere of the nameless town, they began to seem less so. The lack of progress wore heavily on the investigators. Deputy Miller grew quiet, his youthful optimism replaced by a haunted look. Sheriff Thompson, though he maintained a stoic exterior, felt the weight of failure. He had faced killers before, but this one was different. This one felt intangible, uncatchable, as if they were hunting a phantom woven from the town's own nightmares. The case files grew thicker with reports, with interviews, with dead ends. But the crucial breakthrough, the single piece of evidence that would illuminate the darkness, remained elusive. The killer was a whisper in the pines, an unseen enemy.
Perfect.
Eventually, the inevitable happened. Sheriff Thompson and Deputy Miller packed their few belongings. Their car, once a symbol of potential justice, sputtered back down the winding road, leaving the nameless town behind. They had no more leads to follow, no more resources to expend on a case that seemed, honestly, designed to remain unsolved. The official investigation was not closed, but it grew cold, placed in a dusty file cabinet miles away, a testament to a horror that could not be comprehended or contained by the laws of men. The town was left alone once more, alone with its dead and its fear. The departure of the lawmen marked a turning point. Any fragile hope that had flickered died with the sound of their retreating engine. A heavy, resigned silence settled over the nameless town, deeper than before. This was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of surrender. The killer had won. The entity, whether man or myth, remained at large, free to watch, free to wait, free to strike again. The townsfolk understood this. The knowledge settled into their bones like the winter chill. They were trapped, living on borrowed time. Life in the Nameless town changed irrevocably. The few remaining families became more insular. Doors were bolted not just at night but during the pale light of day. Children were rarely seen outdoors. Their laughter, once a rare melody, vanished completely. Some people left quietly, in the dead of night, unable to bear the constant gnawing fear. Those who stayed became shadows of their former selves, their faces etched with a permanent anxiety. The general store saw even less business. The town was slowly dying, strangled by an unseen hand. The legend of the silent killer was no longer a collection of old wives' tales. It was a fresh, bleeding wound. The Miller family massacre became the horrifying centerpiece of this dark folklore, a brutal confirmation of their deepest fears. The woods pressed closer, the shadows grew longer, the silence became a living entity, a constant reminder of the evil that walked among them or watched them from the ancient trees. The case grew colder, but the fear remained, burning like an unholy ember in the heart of the Nameless town. A town forever altered, forever haunted. Two decades passed, 20 slow, grinding years. The Nameless town sank deeper into its quiet despair. The Miller massacre became a scar, a jagged, ugly mark on the collective soul. The memory did not fade. It festered. The children who survived those times grew into adults. They carried the fear in their bones. Their own children, if they dared to have any, were raised on whispered warnings. The forest, a constant brooding presence, seemed to reclaim the edges of the town. Houses decayed, hope dwindled. The legend of the silent killer was no longer a story. It was the truth of their existence, a truth they lived with, every single day. The outside world had largely forgotten them, if it ever truly knew them. Sheriff Thompson was long dead, his unsolved case just a footnote in county records. The Nameless town was a lost place, a pocket of shadow on an old map. Life, such as it was, continued in a muted rhythm. Births were few. Deaths were quiet acceptances. The young left if they could, seeking lives unburdened by the constant, suffocating dread. Those who remained were tied to the land, or to the graves. Or perhaps, honestly, to the fear itself. It had become a familiar, if unwelcome, companion. A heavy cloak worn through every season. Then, one late autumn afternoon, a car appeared. Not a sputtering local truck, but a newer model. Clean. Out of place. It moved slowly down the cracked asphalt of the main street, its engine a foreign sound in the oppressive stillness. Heads turned, curtains twitched. An unfamiliar vehicle was an event, a disturbance. The car stopped in front of what used to be Silas Blackwood's general store. The building was now derelict, its windows boarded, its sign faded beyond recognition. A woman stepped out. She was not young, but her eyes held a spark, a weary determination. Her arrival was a stone dropped into a stagnant pool. The ripples spread quickly. Whispers followed her. Who was she? What did she want? Old memories stirred. Vague recollections of a face, a name. The town had grown accustomed to its ghosts. It was not prepared for a visitor who seemed to carry the weight of the past with such directness. She looked at the decaying town, not with fear, but with a profound sadness. And something else, a resolve, as if she had returned to settle an old outstanding debt. The silence of decades was about to be broken, loudly. The woman was Sarah, Silas Blackwood's niece. She had left the Nameless town many years ago, shortly after the Miller horrors. She had tried to build a life elsewhere, away from the shadows, away from the constant gnawing fear. But the town and its unsolved terrors had a grip on her, a hold that distance could not break. Now, her uncle Silas had passed away. He was one of the last of his generation, the last who truly remembered the details, the nuances, the fear of those terrible times firsthand. Sarah had returned to settle his meager affairs, to close a chapter, or so she thought. Among Silas's few possessions, she found a small, locked wooden box. It was tucked away in the attic of the old store, covered in dust, forgotten. Inside, beneath yellowed ledgers and bundles of old letters, was a journal, Silas's private journal, and a single faded photograph. The photograph showed a group of children playing near the edge of the Whisperwood. Among them, younger versions of faces she vaguely recalled, and the Miller children, Emily and Samuel, smiling, innocent, before the darkness claimed them. The sight of it brought a fresh wave of grief, a sharp, unexpected pain. Silas's journal was not a record of store accounts. It was a chronicle of fear, of suspicion, of a desperate private investigation he had conducted after Sheriff Thompson left. He had never spoken of it. He had carried the burden alone. His entries were terse, filled with cryptic observations, names, dates, strange occurrences he had noted over the years, things he hadn't dared share with the frightened townsfolk, or perhaps with the dismissive authorities. He detailed his own theories, his own quiet torment. He believed the killer was still among them, or that the evil was a legacy, passed down. Sarah read late into the night. The flickering lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls. Each page turned was a step deeper into the town's hidden nightmare. Silas had suspected someone unexpected, someone who had been overlooked. He described watching this person, noting their habits, their solitary walks near the Whisperwood. He wrote of a strange symbol he'd seen, the same symbol found on the parchment in the locket Thomas Henderson discovered so long ago. A symbol he had seen again, years later, near the Miller farm. The journal was a map, a terrifying map into the heart of the town's darkness. News of Sarah Blackwood's return and her discovery spread through the nameless town like a contagion. Not the news of Silas's passing. That was expected. But the news of the journal, of the photograph, of a past that refused to stay buried. The few remaining elders who remembered Sarah as a young woman, who remembered her uncle's quiet strength, now looked at her with a mixture of apprehension and a desperate, flickering hope. Could she succeed where all others had failed, or would she only stir the hornet's nest, waking the dormant beast? The fear, which had become a dull, chronic ache, sharpened again. It became acute, raw. The possibility that Silas had known something, that he had suspected someone specific. This was a terrifying thought. If the killer was one of them, they had lived alongside a monster for decades, shared pleasantries, offered condolences, while all along, the truth festered in their midst. The journal's existence meant the story was not over. The case was not truly cold. It was merely sleeping, waiting for a new spark to reignite its terrible flame. And Sarah was that spark.
Some were angry. They accused Sarah of disturbing the dead, of bringing fresh pain to a town that had suffered enough. Let it be, one old man spat, his eyes burning with resentment. Some doors are best left unopened.
But others felt a reluctant pull, a need to know. The uncertainty had been its own kind of torture. Perhaps, finally, there could be answers, even if those answers were more horrifying than the questions. The children of those who had lived through the Miller terror, now adults themselves, felt a new wave of anxiety for their own families. The town became a tinderbox of renewed suspicion. Old theories resurfaced. Arguments broke out. Accusatory glances were exchanged in the dim light of the failing evening. The journal, though its contents were not yet widely known, became a symbol, a catalyst. Sarah felt the weight of their fear, their hope, their anger. She knew she was treading on dangerous ground. The silent killer, if still alive and in the town, would surely know of her return, of her discovery. The whispers were not just among the townsfolk anymore. She felt a new, cold presence watching her, listening. Sarah knew she could not navigate this labyrinth alone. The town was too insular, too damaged. She thought of Sheriff Thompson, of his failed investigation. But he was gone. Then she remembered someone else, old Elijah, the retired schoolteacher, the one who had kept his own meticulous journals, the one who had worked with her briefly all those years ago, trying to piece together the fragments of memory. Was he still alive? He would be ancient now. If he was, his records, his insights might hold a key, a way to corroborate Silas's chilling entries.
She found Elijah in a small, cluttered cottage on the edge of the town, frail, bedridden. But his eyes, when they focused on her, still held a sharp intelligence. He remembered her. He remembered everything. His voice was a dry rustle like autumn leaves. But his mind was clear. Sarah told him about Silas's journal, about the photograph, about the symbol. Elijah listened. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He directed her to a dusty trunk in the corner of his room. "My own archives?" he whispered. "Perhaps something there can speak for me now."
Inside the trunk, among stacks of neatly bound notebooks, Sarah found a folder. It was labeled simply, Whisperwood Anomalies. Within it were maps, sketches, detailed notes on every unexplained disappearance. every strange sighting, every rumor related to the forest, and there, on a brittle piece of paper, was a careful drawing of the same symbol Silas had described, the symbol from the locket. Elijah had researched it. He had found references to it in obscure local folklore, tales of an old cult, of dark rituals performed deep within the woods, centuries ago. But there was more. Tucked into the back of the folder was a more recent entry, dated just a few years after the Miller murders. Elijah had seen someone he knew, entering a long-abandoned section of the Whisperwood, a section rumored to be cursed. He had followed at a distance. He had seen this person leave something at the base of an ancient, gnarled oak. He had been too afraid to investigate further at the time, too afraid to speak, but he had recorded it. The name of the person, the date, the location. A cold dread washed over Sarah. The archivist's ghost had just handed her a new, terrifying lead. The path led back into the darkness. Sarah clutched the brittle paper from Elijah's trunk. The name written there burned into her mind. A name she knew. A name everyone in the Nameless town knew. It was not a monster from the shadows. It was a face seen in the pale light of day. A quiet presence, always there. The location Elijah described was deep within the Whisperwood, a place where the trees grew too close, where sunlight died before it reached the ground. She had to go. She had to see. The dread was a cold knot in her stomach. But Silas's journal and Elijah's ghost demanded this final terrifying step.
The journey felt like a descent into a forgotten hell. Each snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. The air was heavy, still. The trees watched her, their ancient branches twisted into grotesque shapes. She found the gnarled oak. It was older than the town itself. Its roots clawed at the earth like skeletal fingers, just as Elijah's note described. At its base, hidden beneath a rotted log and a layer of damp leaves, was a small, crudely dug hollow. She reached in. Her fingers brushed against something cold, something smooth. Not metal this time.
It was a collection of small, carved wooden figures. Dozens of them. Each one crudely representing a person. Some were fresh, others were weathered with age, and beside them, a newer version of the locket Thomas Henderson had found. This one contained a small, faded photograph of a child who had vanished from a neighboring county just last year. A child no one in Nameless Town had even known was missing. And then she saw the most recent carving. A small figure, unmistakably resembling Thomas, the boy who found the first locket. He was marked. The name Elijah had written down. It belonged to someone who had mourned with the Miller's friends. Someone who had offered quiet comfort. Someone who had always been there, watching. The truth struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. The killer was not a legend, not a spirit, not a faceless drifter. It was woven into the very fabric of the town. For generations, the symbol, the locket, the disappearances, the Miller massacre. It was a tapestry of horror, crafted by hands they knew, hands they had perhaps shaken. The person Elijah named was not just a killer. They were a curator of the town's pain, a silent puppet master pulling the strings of fear. This revelation did not bring closure. It plunged Sarah into an even deeper, more personal abyss. The face in the shadow was a familiar one. Sarah stumbled back from the ancient oak. The carvings, the locket, the photograph, they were irrefutable. But what now? The person Elijah named was old, frail perhaps, or perhaps they were just one link in a longer, darker chain. Could she expose them? Would anyone believe her? The town was so broken, so steeped in fear and superstition. This truth might shatter the last vestiges of their sanity, or worse, it might provoke the very evil she had uncovered. The killer, or whatever entity they served, had operated with impunity for decades, untouched, unseen by those who refused to look. The knowledge was a poison. It seeped into her, cold, debilitating. Even if this individual was brought to justice or simply died, would it end? Elijah's notes spoke of a cult, of rituals. Was this person merely the latest iteration of an ancient evil? The silent killer was perhaps more than a single murderer. It was a role, a legacy passed down through the shadows of the Nameless town. The fear that had haunted this place was not born of imagination. It was a response to a very real, very patient predator. A predator who wore the skin of a neighbor, a friend. The town would never be free. This revelation offered no solace, only a more profound understanding of its damnation. The unanswered questions multiplied. How many more were involved? How many secrets still lay buried beneath the whispering pines? The shadow of the legend would not lift. It would only deepen. It would twist into new, more terrifying shapes. The children of Nameless Town would continue to grow up under its oppressive weight. They would inherit the fear, the silence, the unending vigil against an enemy that could be anywhere. Anyone. The silent killer? The name itself was a prophecy. The evil thrived in the town's isolation, in its unwillingness to confront the darkness within. The legend lived on, not just in stories, but in the terrified eyes of the townsfolk, in the locked doors, in the empty spaces left by the lost. The Whisperwood stood sentinel, its secrets held tight. The true horror was not just the acts of violence, it was the chilling realization that the monster could wear a familiar face. And the silence, the deep dark silence of the Nameless Town, remained its most faithful accomplice, forever.